I've been using the updated Vallejo Game Air range for over 2 years now, and here's what I've learned. How do they perform for Zenithal base coats and detail work? Are they really as clog-free as promised? And how do they compare to other airbrush paints? I'll answer all of that in this long-term review. Vallejo's updated Game Air paints arrived in autumn 2023 and I picked up the complete range straight away. I've been using them ever since, and in this video I'll give you the key facts you need to know. I've also prepared plenty of demos. I'll show you how they handle gradients and zenithal base coats, some of my projects I've used them for, and how they stack up against Warpaints Air and the Warhammer Color Air range. And at the end, you'll get my honest verdict after over 2 years of use. Would I recommend them, or are there better alternatives? By the way, I'm Stahly from Tale of Painters. I've spent over 2 decades painting Warhammer and tabletop miniatures, and on my channel I test and review all the latest hobby paints. I'm a real paint nerd, and I also maintain this library of professional, hand-painted color swatches for you to download, the Stahly swatch system. Vallejo have been super prolific lately and completely overhauled their hobby paint lineup over the past few years. In collaboration with Angel Giraldez, the game color range was reworked from the ground up with a brand new formula in 2022. I did an in-depth video on that at the time. Then, about a year later, Game Air got the same treatment. The new Game Air range comprises 51 colors, a thinner, a flow improver and 7 primers, so 60 paints in total. There are no metallics or fluo paints in the range. Well, technically there are, but more on that later. Each bottle contains 80 ml of paint, and I really like Vallejo's dropper bottles with their reinforced nozzles. The paints come pre-thinned, so in theory you can pour them straight into the airbrush cup without clogging or any other issues. Whether that actually holds up in practice, I'll show you in a moment. But there's another big selling point. The colors are supposed to perfectly match their counterparts from the game color range. I'll be putting that to the test as well, so stay tuned. Let's start simple. I have a few Glade Guard models here for Warhammer the Old World. I sprayed them with Renegade Green primer from the Color Forge, but the primer didn't reach every spot. So I'm giving them an even base coat through the airbrush using Game Air Dark Green. My weapon of choice here is the Mr. Hobby PS 289, a solid upper mid-range airbrush with a 0.3mm nozzle. I pour the dark green straight into the cup without thinning and set the pressure to around 20 to 22 psi. The paint atomizes beautifully and the covering power is excellent. What I noticed straight away is that Vallejo has clearly added a generous amount of flow improver and retarder to the formula. The paint stays wet on the model for quite a long time. I occasionally had to speed things up with a hairdryer before applying a second or third thin coat. On the flip side, there is no tip dry or clogging even after extended spraying, and I could really pour the paint straight from the bottle into the airbrush. Here I have Infinity's Lament, the Aeldari Warhammer Plus miniature I recently painted for my Craft World Airbrush collection. I base coated the Wraith Lord's remains with Game Air Turquoise, then applied shading with the darker Abyssal Turquoise, switching to a .0mm nozzle airbrush for that. Most colors in the Game Air range are grouped into triads, though unfortunately there's no lighter turquoise for highlighting. So I mixed a little dead white into the Game Air turquoise, which worked perfectly well, and applied controlled highlights. Since I continued working on the model with the corresponding game color paints after airbrushing, it's incredibly handy that the Game Air range matches its game color counterparts. But does that really hold up, even though the paint sometimes looks slightly different in the bottle? I've put together a quick test, picking out a few color pairs at random. On the left you'll always see the Game Air version, with the corresponding game color painted over it on the right side of the model. The match is genuinely spot on. It looks like the exact same pigment mixes are used throughout. The only difference is a slight variation in finish. Game colors are very matte, while Game Air has a softer matte with just a touch more sheen. That's probably down to the additional additives needed to make the paints airbrush ready. The color match to the game color range is a real selling point, and in my hand-painted Vallejo game color swatch, I've marked all the colors that are also available in a Game Air version. Never buy the wrong colors again with my Stahly swatch system. You can find cross-comparable swatches for all the major hobby paint brands on my Patreon. But how do these paints handle Zenithal base coating when you want those ultra smooth transitions from light to dark? Here I've sprayed a model with a black primer from the Game Air range straight over bare plastic. There are 7 primers in total, and some colors like Sun Yellow and Bloody Red are available both as a standard Game Air version and as a dedicated primer. The difference is twofold: finish and adhesion. The primers dry a bit more satin, and I guess they use polyurethane as binder, which is more durable than standard acrylic resins. The self-leveling properties are also pretty good. The only thing I don't really like is that the primer sometimes becomes flaky in the cup, especially if you add a bit of thinner to it. I didn't have any problems when spraying it though. Adhesion and durability naturally can't compete with solvent-based primers like Mr. Surfacer from Mr. Hobby, but for a non-toxic acrylic primer, the Vallejo primers are alright. For the Zenithal gradient, I spray Game Air Dead White straight from the bottle onto the black model from above, simulating natural light direction. To achieve a finer spray pattern, I recommend adding a little Vallejo airbrush thinner and increasing the pressure to around 40 to 45 psi. Atomization is decent, you can see just a supple texture in the transitions. One thing always worth keeping in mind: when it comes to smoothness of spray pattern, water-based acrylics can't compete with alcohol-based acrylics or lacquer paints like those from Tamiya or Mr. Hobby. Those paints do require a solid extraction setup and proper filters in your respirator though, because the fumes are no joke. Even for regular airbrush paints, I would recommend at minimum a respirator with a fine particle filter. One of my favorite techniques is spraying a colored Zenithal base coat, like on these Tyranid warriors. Combined with contrast style paints, aka slap chop, this style of pre-shading adds more depth and life to your miniatures. For my version of the High Fleet Kraken scheme, I first sprayed a base coat of Game Air Scarlet Red over a dark burgundy primer from Colorforge. Next is Anthea skin at an angle, again with a bit of thinner and increased pressure to over 40 psi. While you watch the paint build up in thin layers, please take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. 84% of you watching my videos haven't subscribed yet, and more subscribers would really help me get the channel out there. I bring you the latest paint reviews completely unbiased and unsponsored, so hit subscribe to stay in the loop. Right, I've switched to pure dead white, which I spray only straight from above as a final highlight. The dark red sitting in the recesses is far less harsh than pure black, and it harmonizes much better with the red carapace. By the way, you'll find a free tutorial for the scheme over on my website, Tale of Painters. Before we get to the metallics question, here's a quick comparison with Warpaints Air and Citadel, aka Warhammer Color Air. I've brought along this Chibi Eva 01 mech kit from Tokyo and primed it black. For the base coat of the purple armor, I started with Bradmother Purple from the Warpaints Air range. Straight from the bottle, it quickly caused clogging, even after pushing the pressure above 25 psi. With Warpaints Air, you should always add a few drops of thinner to be safe. For the mid-tone, I switched over to Warhammer Air, Camos Air specifically. I added a small drop of thinner as a precaution, but was pleasantly surprised by how well it sprayed and atomized. The only pain was getting the paint out of the pot and into the cup. Airbrush paints that don't come in dropper bottles really should be banned. For the highlights, I moved to Game Air Lustful Purple, switching back to the Mr. Hobby PS290 with a finer 0.2mm nozzle. Atomization and transition smoothness were both very good. There were just 1 or 2 tiny specks here and there, but that was down to me rather than the paint. By the way, should I make more videos about airbrush paints? And if so, which ones? Let me know in the comments. As I mentioned earlier, what you won't find in the Game Air range are metallics or fluorescent colors. According to the Game Air leaflet, you need to turn to the Game Color range for those. The fluo paints have a consistency that works perfectly in the airbrush, and the metallics are also thinner compared to, for example, the model color metallics. I did flag that in my Game Color review, finding them a touch thin for brush painting. That said, for the airbrush they're pretty much perfect. With my .0mm nozzle, I just added a drop of thinner and a little flow improver in an 80:20 ratio, a recipe I borrowed from Vince Venturella that served me very well. The result is fantastic. A beautiful finish with a high level of reflectivity and very fine metallic flakes. Vallejo really know how to make good metallic paints. The only weak spot is the covering power of the golds, which isn't quite as good as the silvers and coppers. Vallejo have since released a True Metallic Metal series, which also includes pre-thinned airbrush versions. The golds there cover much better and are a solid replacement for the Game Color ones. Have a look at my True Metallic Metal swatch for a direct comparison. Right, on to the verdict and my one final criticism. I've been using the Game Air paints for nearly 2.5 years across all kinds of projects, and they became one of my favorite airbrush ranges. They atomize very well for a water-based acrylic paint, cover nicely, and thanks to the generous amount of flow improver, you really have to work hard to clog the airbrush. They are truly ready to use straight away and don't need extra thinning. Of course, instead of buying dedicated airbrush paints, you could always use your regular paints and thin them down. But that means experimenting every time to find the right ratio and figure out whether the thinner and paint play nicely together. Since switching to dedicated airbrush paints, clogs and problems have dropped off dramatically for me, and airbrushing became just a much more enjoyable experience overall. So while it's not a must-have, it's such a quality of life upgrade in my opinion. I'm giving the Game Air range a solid 8 out of 10. Really, my only criticism is that the range is limited to only 60 colors, and not every shade from the Game Color range is available in an airbrush version. Because the perfect color match to Game Color is, for me, the single greatest advantage of this product. Learn more about the Game Color range in the video here on the right, where I'll also take a closer look at the metallics and fluorescent paints. Thanks a lot and happy hobbying!